All right, so let's dive into one of the most, honestly, I think one of the most volatile situations happening in the world right now, the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's complex, it's constantly evolving, and some recent events have really thrown a wrench into things.
Yeah.
We're talking about President Biden's authorization for Ukraine to use those long-range ATACMS missiles, potentially even within Russian territory. And this decision, I mean, it's been prompted in part by North Korea sending troops to support Russia, which has really escalated tensions. So we're going to break it all down for you today. We've got some great analysis from El Dibber, DW.com, and El Independiente to draw on. And, we'll be examining the potential consequences of this decision, and we'll explore how a possible Trump presidency in 2024 might impact the conflict. And we'll also try to gauge just how real of a risk this is of a global escalation.
Well, I think what's important to understand first is that these ATACMS missiles have a range of 300 kilometers. So that means Ukraine can now strike targets deep inside Russia. This isn't just about hitting military outposts near the border anymore. It's about potentially disrupting Russia's entire war effort.
Yeah, that's something I found really interesting in the El Debr analysis. They suggest that Russia might perceive this as like a direct threat to their ability to wage war at all, almost as a move by NATO itself, not just the U.S.
Right, and that's why this is such a risky move, really. Russia has repeatedly warned about crossing red lines, and this could be one of them. And it really increases the risk of a much wider war, something that's got a lot of European leaders on edge. Some countries, as DW.com points out, are fully behind Ukraine. They want to see Russia push back. Others, though, are wary of this escalation, and they worry that it could make a negotiated peace even harder to achieve.
It's a tough question. I mean, Ukraine certainly has the right to defend itself, and these missiles give them a much stronger deterrent. But as El Independiente points out, provoking Russia too much could backfire pretty spectacularly.
Exactly. It's a really delicate balancing act. The potential consequences are huge. And then, as if this situation wasn't already volatile enough, you throw the 2024 U.S. presidential election into the mix.
Right. The Trump factor. It's like the wild card nobody seems to know how to play.
Well, a potential Trump return to the White House definitely adds a whole new layer of complexity here. His past statements on Ukraine have been, well, let's just say less than supportive. He's criticized U.S. aid, he suggested he could resolve the conflict quickly, and he's even expressed, admiration for Putin's leadership.
And El Independiente even goes so far as suggesting that a second Trump presidency could lead to concessions that are very unfavorable to Ukraine, potentially even fracturing NATO. They point to his past affinity for Putin and his questioning of NATO's value. So, I mean, do you think that's a realistic possibility? Could a Trump presidency really reshape the geopolitical landscape that drastically?
Well, let's not forget that Trump has often acted unpredictably on the world stage. It's certainly possible he could strike a deal with Putin, but what that deal would look like and who it would benefit, that's anyone's guess. And, like we were just saying, the potential for a Trump presidency to really just throw a wrench into things is a real concern.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to predict what a Trump administration would do in this situation, which, I mean, is a concern in itself.
Absolutely. That uncertainty is, well, it's unsettling for everyone,
Yep.
especially for Ukraine.
And speaking of uncertainty, we can't forget about the other major player who's kind of just entered the scene, North Korea.
Right. Their decision to actually send troops to support Russia has added a whole new level of volatility to all of this. It's really fueling fears of a wider conflict, something that both El Debr and El Independiente are very concerned about.
Yeah, it's like almost like a geopolitical powder keg just ready to blow. What I found particularly chilling was El Debr's analysis that if Russia sees these ATACMS missiles as an existential threat, they might lash out in ways we haven't even considered yet. I mean, they have hypersonic missiles. They could target critical infrastructure in Europe, maybe even launch cyber attacks.
That's the nightmare scenario, isn't it?
Yeah.
A NATO member gets attacked, Article 5 is triggered, and suddenly we're on the brink of a full-blown war between, nuclear superpowers.
It's terrifying to even think about. Okay, let's take a step back from the brink for a second and try to map out what the future might hold.
Yeah.
Our sources have outlined 3 potential scenarios, each with its own set of ramifications.
Okay, let's hear them.
So the first scenario is a controlled escalation that leads to negotiations.
Yeah. All right, so in this scenario, Ukraine uses these ATACMS strategically, maybe targeting military infrastructure, but, avoiding civilian casualties or anything that could be seen as an attack on Russia's leadership.
Right. Exactly.
The goal would be to kind of demonstrate their newfound strength, but in a way that doesn't provoke a full retaliation. It's a high-stakes gamble. But if it works, it could force Russia to the negotiating table.
What about the second scenario, the one where things, spiral out of control?
That's the one that keeps a lot of people up at night. This is where Russia responds to the ATACMS with much broader attacks, potentially targeting, not just Ukraine, but also NATO countries that are supporting Kiev. Think power grids, communication networks, even financial systems.
So cyber attacks, blackouts, economic chaos, that would definitely escalate things quickly.
It would, and it would also put immense pressure on NATO to respond. And that's where the risk of a wider war becomes very real.
Okay, and then there's the third scenario, the one where a Trump presidency, throws everything up in the air.
This one is definitely harder to predict because it hinges on a lot of unknowns. But based on Trump's past behavior and statements, our sources suggest that a Trump-driven diplomatic agreement might be on the table.
A peace deal, but on whose terms?
That's the million-dollar question. Trump's history suggests he might be willing to push for a deal that favors Russia, potentially even involving territorial concessions from Ukraine, which would be highly controversial.
Right, so a short-term win for peace, but at what cost? Our sources from DW.com and El Independiente point out that this could really shatter the credibility of NATO, and it could embolden other aggressors around the world.
It's a classic dilemma, isn't it? Do you prioritize a quick resolution, even if it means making compromises that could have some really dangerous long-term consequences?
It's a tough call, and one that future leaders will have to grapple with.
And it's important to remember that these three scenarios aren't mutually exclusive. They could blend together, creating a much more complex and unpredictable situation. And we also have to remember that our sources didn't really touch on the potential role of China in all of this.
Right, China's been relatively quiet, but they're a major player. And they have a complex relationship with both Russia and the West.
Absolutely. They've been walking a diplomatic tightrope, so to speak, trying to maintain their economic ties with Russia while not alienating the West.
So how might China react to these latest developments? El Daber does touch on this a little. They suggest that China might see this as an opportunity to assert their influence on the global stage. But I feel like it's a question that deserves a deeper dive. Could China actually become a decisive factor in this conflict?
Yeah, it's something worth thinking about. If China throws their weight behind Russia, or even just provides more economic and diplomatic support, it could really shift the balance of power. And if they choose to side more openly with the West, that could put immense pressure on Russia.
It's almost like we're watching a geopolitical chess match play out. Every move has consequences, and the stakes just keep getting higher.
Yeah, it is a fascinating situation, that's for sure. And concerning, definitely concerning. And yeah, like you said, the stakes just keep getting higher and higher.
Yeah, it really is a lot to process. We've covered a lot of ground. The ATACMS missiles, a potential Trump presidency, just totally changing things up. The involvement of North Korea and now China. It's a lot.
What I think is really interesting is that we're seeing a real shift in the global balance of power. The old alliances, the things we thought were certain, they're crumbling, and new ones are emerging. And how this conflict in Ukraine plays out, well, it could very well determine what the new world order looks like.
I think you're right. It's definitely a pivotal moment in history.
Yeah.
And the decisions these leaders are making in Washington, Moscow, Kyiv, Beijing, they're going to have ripple effects, ones that'll be felt for generations.
And it's not just about governments and militaries either. It's about ordinary people.
Yeah.
People in Ukraine, their lives have been totally upended. People in Europe, they're facing energy shortages and economic uncertainty. People all over the world are feeling the consequences of this conflict.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Well, I think first and foremost, it means staying informed. Don't just rely on headlines and sound bites. Dig deeper, explore different perspectives, question your assumptions.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to ask those tough questions. What are the real motivations of the players involved? What are the potential consequences, both intended and unintended, of the actions being taken? The more we understand about the complexities of this conflict, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the future.
It's a call to action. We can't just sit back and watch this unfold. We need to engage in dialogue, hold our leaders accountable, and advocate for solutions that prioritize peace and stability.
Because ultimately, this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the kind of world we want to live in, a world where might makes right, or a world where diplomacy, cooperation, and respect for international law prevail. That's the choice we're facing.
That's a powerful thought. And this deep dive has really given us a lot to think about. We've explored the forces at play in this incredibly complex and ever-evolving conflict, and I hope you've come away with a deeper understanding of what's at stake. So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a better world.